Good morning and welcome to the first Economy Committee meeting of this Assembly year. Our main item of business this morning is a discussion on the skills and training needed for London's economic recovery. I'd like to welcome all the new members to the Economy Committee. All of the members, save myself, are brand new. We have Hina Bakari, Marina Ahmed, Neil Garrett, Kripesh Harani, Zach Polanski and Sakina Sheikh. I'd like to welcome you all to the Economy Committee. Can I please ask everybody present to turn off your electronic devices so we have no interruptions unnecessary? Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out in item 2 and ask if members have any other interests to declare?
No.
Can we note the membership of the chairing arrangements, the terms of reference and the standing delegation of authority for the Economy Committee as agreed in the annual meeting May 14th, 2021? Can we confirm the minutes of the Economy Committee meeting held on the 2nd of March 2022 to be signed by me as a correct record?
Noted.
Can I ask the committee to note the completed, ongoing and closed actions arising from previous meetings and the additional correspondence sent and received?
Noted.
Can I ask the committee to note the actions taken by the former chair of the committee as outlined in the agenda report?
Noted.
Can I ask the committee to note the Mayor's responses to committee outputs as outlined in the agenda report?
Noted.
We now move on to our main item of business, the discussion with invited guests on skills and training in relation to London's economic recovery from COVID-19. Can I start by saying good morning to all our guests? We have Michelle Como-Bora, Assistant Director for Skills and Employment, GLA. We have Matthew Walsham, Policy Lead, Partnerships for Young London. We have James Moon, Area Manager of the Careers and Enterprise Company, and Jonathan Cribb, Senior Research Economist, Institute of Fiscal Studies. And later we'll be joined by Deputy Mayor Jules Pipe. Jules is the Deputy Mayor for Planning and Regeneration and Skills. As is the tradition in our committees, as Chair, I'll take the first few questions. So I want to start with Matthew. Morning, Matthew. What are the particular ways in which younger Londoners have been economically affected by the pandemic?
Sure. So, yeah, thank you, Sean, and good morning. We did a piece of work around COVID-19 and looking at the impact to the kind of beginning of the third lockdown. And I think there's kind of two key areas. One is kind of how COVID-19 has affected generally other aspects of their lives and specifically on employment. I think firstly, in general, we've found that 29% of young people said that COVID-19 had impacted their mental health negatively. We did a WHO score of mental health, and we found that quite a lot of young people were sort of scoring WHO's well-being scores of sort of unwell or close to a line of clinical depression. So there's a sort of mental health crisis brewing. And the second aspect was, a third of young people said that COVID had impacted their housing situation. And this was kind of disproportionate. So, more disabled young people, those in care experience, more likely to say their housing has been disrupted. So that's moving, rents going up, kind of changing. So COVID-19 kind of creates that general disruption to their sort of learning and work life. In terms of employment specifically, though, half of the young people that we talked to, and we surveyed about 1,600 young people over the course of lockdown, half of them, 51%, said that their future employment plans had changed as a result of COVID-19 or lockdown. Again, disproportionate, more likely that young women in care experience, young people, more likely to say that on average, their future had changed. But when we asked them kind of more generally about their household, had someone in your household had their employment affected, whether that's losing their job, being furloughed, this is around 2/3, 66.6%. So, a lot of young people either being affected by the pandemic in terms of their employment or future, or they know someone who has, or they're rethinking what they're doing. We also did some focus groups to kind of boil down exactly how COVID-19 changed what they were thinking. And it kind of boiled down to three themes. One, many people had been furloughed or lost their jobs, as clear as that. The second one, young people who are currently entering the job market, after the transition point had been rethinking, thinking about retraining, or quite a lot of them who had the option to, mostly from affluent backgrounds, are thinking about going on to further education instead of trying to get a job during this time. And the third way is around the way that COVID-19 has cut the hours that young people work, working from home for those who are allowed to, but generally changing the working environment. I'll bring in one other thing from here, and YE 2030 and Clearview Research, who contributed to our report, they did a really good piece where they found that young people who identify as Black Caribbean are more likely to have been furloughed due to COVID-19 compared to other ethnic groups. The young people who identify as Black Caribbean or Asian Pakistani are more likely than other ethnic groups to have had their working hours reduced to COVID-19. Huge impact, but a very disproportionate impact.
One additional question, Matthew. Your last statement about the ethnic breakdown, was that to do with the type of employment that these communities, my community, is more likely to have?
Sorry, say that again?
So you talked about people from, for instance, Caribbean community having greater instances of being furloughed or having their hours reduced, etc. Was that because of the type of employment they generally have, or was there another factor?
So I don't think Clearview Research sort of kind of went into types of employment. I mean, it's more likely, I probably would get back in terms of writing around ethnic breakdown of more insecure work around zero hours contracts and agency working. I think that's more likely to be furloughed. And obviously we can find some specific data around, the different sectors that were more likely affected, like hospitality, and the creative industry, which in particular has been hit very hard.
Okay, thank you. My next question I'd like to direct to Jonathan, if I may. How have older Londoners been affected by the COVID-19 outbreak and the lockdowns? Has it affected their employability? Has it affected how regularly people are losing their jobs? How's older community been affected? And by older, I said probably talking about people 35 upwards, really.
So the youngest people in society are most likely to have lost their jobs or have been furloughed. But there is a kind of U-shape by age. So by the time you get up to people in their 50s and their 60s, they are, there's a rising probability of them having been furloughed relative to people in their 30s and 40s. Right. And that actually is particularly for people post state pension age, so 65, 66 and plus. There aren't that many people who are in work at those ages, but of those who are, a lot of them have been furloughed. I think the big challenge for older people, older Londoners, is that they are not, if the furlough scheme, when the furlough scheme ends and some of these people will lose their jobs completely, the challenge is that changing job is just a much less common thing for older workers to do, and particularly changing occupation. If they've been in retail, for example, and retail jobs are shrinking, these people aren't as accustomed to switching jobs, switching occupation as people who are younger than them, and that risks kind of longer term unemployment, and indeed it risks them struggling on what is a relatively thin safety welfare system for people without children, as most of these older people don't have children living with them. So I think that's the kind of concern about older people, and that they don't necessarily have some of the support networks either through the welfare state or through kind of extended family that some of the younger adults do.
Okay, thank you. That's a very good answer. Thank you very much for that. Let me ask a question to Jonathan and then to Matthew. If you could just both give me short answers, I'd really appreciate that. You alluded to this earlier, Matthew, when you talked about the racial effect of the change in economic circumstances. But is there any particular trends that are sticking out to you that have affected people because of their racial background? You talked about the Caribbean community and Pakistani people as well. Is there anything else that's sticking out to you?
So our research, if it's okay to go first, our research identifies one community or people from a certain background as being more vulnerable during the crisis, which is those from Pakistani and Bangladeshi backgrounds. And that's not necessarily because their employment is done much worse than other groups, but it's because on average, prior to the pandemic, those people from those backgrounds were more likely to be only single earner households, to rely on often, but not exclusively, the income from a man. And so when, compared to dual earner households, when one person is furloughed or one person loses their job, that means the whole household then becomes workless and doesn't have any income coming in. Compared to other groups where, if a husband, for example, loses their job, the wife might be more, be reworking too. So in terms of worklessness, I think there is that Pakistani and Bangladeshi group that look more vulnerable.
Okay, thank you. Matthew?
Yeah, and I think I completely agree with that. I think what we found is, as a group, it's not necessarily ethnicity. I think one of the clearest groups we found in disproportionality is around care experienced young people. So the way that care leavers are transitioning to work or apprenticeships and, having to manage private housing costs, rising private housing costs, and then also continuing their education. So they're probably the group. I think when it comes to, when we do research around ethnicity, it's really difficult to separate that intersectionality. So yes, we do find disproportionality with Black young people, with Bangladeshi, Pakistani, but then, we find that disproportionate between outer London and inner London, and it kind of comes down to socio-economic level. Because we can't really collect that detailed data on sort of under 16s especially, it's hard to separate to say, generally Trust for London has some really fantastic stats on the poverty profile, which really show that socioeconomic level and poverty deprivation are probably one of the biggest predictors of educational outcome and then kind of work opportunities as a result.
Okay, thank you for that. It's interesting that you make the distinction. You suggest it's hard to make the distinction often just along sort of racial lines. There's other societal things where you live in or out of London that impact that. Thank you for your answer. I really appreciate that.
I'm so sorry. It's a technical issue. My apologies for interrupting. I don't know if it's just me, but I'm finding it very difficult to hear the panel. I do understand that our technical people have tried to improve it, but I just wonder if the panel could perhaps speak close to their own mics when they're speaking, because I really cannot hear what the answers are.
Okay, I don't know if you heard my colleague. She's making a plea for us to all speak up so as we pick it up. I know our mics in here aren't the best, and I hope your mic is better than ours. But I'm going to pass you on to Assemblymember Bakari now. She has a few questions to ask.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to clarify, when you're talking about the question on race, are you talking about all age groups?
If you're talking to me, then no,
Yes.
not at all age groups.
Jonathan
so we do
or
research
Matthew?
with sort of 11-year-olds to 25. So when it comes to 18 to 25, you have a clearer idea about the socioeconomic level, but under 16, it's a lot harder. But no, specifically under 25.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to move on to disability, and if I could focus my questions with Michelle, and I understand the Deputy Mayor is not here yet, but he may be able to add on later on. Michelle, thank you for joining us. I'm really keen to know how disabled Londoners have been affected by the pandemic, differently to perhaps the non-disabled Londoners. And when you do discuss your answer, please let me know whether there is any possibility then for following a recommendation of the Trust for London, Social Mobility Foundation, the CBI, of recommending a disability task force that might focus on this particular subject and perhaps make some progress.
Thanks. I was desperately trying to scroll through to see if I can find some stats on disabled Londoners and how they've been affected by the pandemic. Our colleagues on the call may well have that information. I don't personally, so they may be better able to answer that in slightly more detail. What I do know is from the work we've been doing at City Hall that disabled Londoners were already likely to be more likely to be unemployed before the pandemic. and that has likely to increase through the pandemic. We are certainly looking at the different interventions that we can make for disabled Londoners across a range of our programmes, and the focus of all of the recovery work that the Mayor is leading on is about inclusivity, and that's inclusivity around all the different groups that have been most affected by the pandemic. Through some of our programmes, and I can talk a little bit about that. I don't know if you want me to do that or you want to have a little bit more detail about how disabled Londoners have been particularly affected, because I can see Matthew is nodding that he has some of that information.
I would like to know quite clearly if there is any plans to set up a disability task force.
I think we're looking into that. We have a range of we have a range of activity that we're doing with disabled Londoners groups, in particular the adult education roadmap, which we are currently out to consultation on. We are ensuring that we're getting the views of different groups of Londoners through that, and disabled Londoners are one aspect of it. I think the easiest way of answering that is we're still looking into that at the moment.
Great, good to hear, thank you. Michelle, I hope you can answer this question. Have men and women been affected differently by the impacts of the labour market?
Yes, so again, our colleagues who are sort of, experts in their field will probably be able to give far more detail on this. But yes, we know that women have been more affected than men throughout the pandemic through the activity that we've been doing, and particularly those women that have caring responsibilities as well. So many of the activities that we're planning and the recovery programme is focusing again on how do we engage women in our programmes to help them get back into work. We do have some success in this area. So we know that the adult education budget, for example, which is our £330 million a year, around 70% of all of those participants on that programme through the various different aspects of adult education are women. So we are looking at how we can engage more women in those subjects that will help them get into work. And then through some of our other programmes, such as the academies, which I think we might come on to a little bit later in more detail, again, how can we focus on women and getting them the right skills to get them into those good jobs that we know are available.
I mean, is there anything specifically for women, perhaps from ethnic minority groups, that you might be looking into?
Well, again, I think a lot of our work probably would tackle all of those aspects. So we do have a range of different programmes. So, for example, some of our ESOL work is looking at particular groups, and I think particularly at those with caring responsibilities. And again, all of our activity, particularly through the academies work, is focusing on those groups that have been most disproportionately affected. Our academies work, which we're launching in the next couple of weeks, will have a specific programme that will run alongside it to support employers. And that is related to the Workforce Integration Network activity that has taken place over the last few years. And that is really focused at breaking down those barriers and making sure that employers are able to employ people from those groups that are underrepresented disproportionately within their sectors. So those will be focusing on some of those activities.
Thank you. I'm going to move to Jonathan Cribb. I'm quite interested in particular groups in London where multiple demographic characteristics or inequalities intersect, for whom the economic impact of the pandemic has been particularly severe. But I also would like you to touch on perhaps on how the hybrid working approach might be impacting certain groups as well. Could you help me with that answer?
So on hybrid, you mean the mix of working within offices and at home?
Yes, that's correct. Yes.
Okay. So, in terms of if you were to pick out a particular group that has found it difficult during the COVID crisis, I believe it is those who are self-employed and not eligible for the SACE scheme for one or other reasons. I think it is useful to look at kind of who has been furloughed and things like that, but the fact that the government has stepped up with so much protection really means that when you're looking at who's done worst, it's about who's fallen through the gaps. And we do see that like big rises in deprivation, for example, among self-employed people who have lost work and been unable to claim the SACE scheme. So that will often be people who are newly self-employed or were only did a little bit of self-employment along the side of other work. That some of that in particular is thinking around the gig economy, and I guess will be more likely to be clustered among relatively young people with relatively low education compared to the capital as a whole, and often people from ethnic minority backgrounds. But that's a function of the fact that that certain people are more likely to be in a slightly more insecure form of self-employment work, and that the SAFE scheme is kind of generous to those who get it, but very patchy in terms of the number of people that get it. In terms of the hybrid working, some research that's been done on this simply implies that the number of jobs that are the kind of cafe and restaurant and shops in city centres, and London will be one of those, are more likely to shrink as more people are working from home. There are fewer people in offices. It is a bit hard to tell how long, what the kind of medium to long term impact will be of this. But to the extent that it's hard for people to kind of switch jobs or to find new jobs, there could be difficulties there, particularly if you got, for example, lots more people working in outer London in their homes than in inner London in their offices.
Okay, thank you. James Moon, if I can ask you a question about areas of London, in particular boroughs that you think might be more affected than others. Do you think that is the case?
I think what we've seen, and not just in terms of COVID, but more broadly, is that when we're looking at employer engagement, some outer London boroughs had less engagement than some of the inner London boroughs. So your central regions tend to have lots of employers that they can engage with, and if young people are based in institutions within those regions, there's accessibility there. I think in some of our outer London boroughs that is more challenging, not least because there are larger employers potentially there, and where there are larger employers, at times there is transport issues that exist. Almost conversely, during lockdown, what we have seen is the switch to a lot of virtual work experience, for example, within schools, and that has reduced some of those barriers that I was discussing a moment ago. So we have young people that can access programs and support from employers that they may previously not have been able to access. That does not mean that we believe that experiences of the workplace for young people should continue to be solely virtual. We think it's hugely important that young people have the opportunity to go into the workplace, and there's no replacement for that experiential learning that you get from within a workplace. But we do see a world continuing where there is as with many things, a hybrid model. We absolutely see some of the outer London boroughs that have been affected more broadly in terms of careers education, but we've also seen some glimmers because of the adaptation that's been required, where some of those have been benefiting also.
Thank you. It does sound like the hybrid approach is being quite well supported by some of our panel guests. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Just move on to Marina, but just and then you can do the next set. You feel like you've done them all.
Yeah, just the next two, so I can go straight on to
Yeah,
section
go straight in. Great.
We're moving on to question 2, getting Londoners back into work. And Matthew, I'm just going to head up the first couple of questions to you. What will be key to providing the skills and training that young Londoners need to get into good work?
So I think to echo the previous point, I think work experience is extremely important and something that's been disrupted during COVID-19 period. We surveyed young people, most of them, sort of 76%, are really keen and interested in work experience. I think currently the problem within London, and this, I think this is before COVID-19, this is exacerbated by it, is twofold. One, the cost of work experience. While 73 or 76% were interested in doing it, only half of them that we surveyed said that they probably could afford to do an unpaid internship. Actually, sort of only 20%, the vast majority, kind of 50+% that they couldn't afford to do an unpaid internship. And this kind of goes above 50% when we're looking at working class young, self-identified working class young people, young disabled people. And the older a young person gets, the more likely they were to be in private housing, the less likely they could afford to do an unpaid internship. And I think the second one, which is kind of key of how we link up with employers, is how they source those internships and work experience. What the common barrier is for them doing work experience. 51% said the lack of connections was number one. So only 8% of everyone we asked said there were no barriers. There's quite a lot of barriers, but the number one every single time was, the lack of connection. I think really clearly every young Londoner should be getting kind of 100 hours of work experience at least. They can make the decisions about what they want to do with diverse sort of work experience options for young people from different backgrounds. But the difference is that if they are forced to kind of source those work experience themselves without those social connections, it doesn't quite work as well, and you kind of reinforce those inequalities. And I think the second one, as we kind of know, which is always the sort of elephant in the room, is careers advice and guidance. Majority of young people, 50% of them kind of want careers advice, and more than 50%, majority of young people want careers advice and guidance. But when we asked them, whether there was good quality careers advice and guidance in London, only a third said there was. And obviously that was more likely if they went to a private school or a grammar school, state school, that was even less. So despite kind of want for it, there's a lack of it. And that's kind of echoed in Clearview research piece. And this was across England, where only 5% of young people they surveyed in England rank a career advisor as the top source of advice when looking for work. Still very much informal. So, a quarter of them go to family, 10th of them go to friends. It's kind of Google, and they're kind of doing it, formally on their own. Careers advice and guidance is very patchy across different local authorities and different schools. Getting kind of a clear, consistent offer there that matches up with employers' needs and it's open to everybody, and then kind of also matching that with their work experience placements as well. And I think that's a good step.
Thank you for your answer.
So just before we move on, can I just bring in Assembly Member Garrett?
Thank you. I'm just picking up on this question about unpaid internships, and I'm just curious. From your answer, it's quite a barrier to people, as you've described. Some people much more so than others, and I'm just wondering if I'm curious, really. Firstly, the size of that barrier. Let's say you're somebody who can't afford to do an unpaid internship. How much, in practical terms, of a barrier is that? And other particular sectors where it's almost a brick wall. And then, secondly, is that a problem that is generally growing and getting worse, or sort of declining, or is just a sort of perennial feature that's neither improving nor going away?
I mean, I think it is getting better. I think there's been a political shift. So, there's political internships and work experience now when they're more visible and more likely to be picked up on. But I think within certain sectors like hospitality, especially the arts and creative sector, it's probably more likely. But I think it's a supply and demand thing. I think the sectors that are more likely to see young people from backgrounds who can afford to do them, can continue doing unpaid internships. For me, it's not so much the sectors that I'm focused on, but it's about the groups that are being disadvantaged from it. So care leavers and disabled young people were most likely in our study to come out as having trouble with COVID-19 around finance and housing. Disabled young people were twice as likely than the average to say that their housing situation had been affected during COVID-19. We did this survey with 3,400 young people with the Museum of London just at the beginning of lockdown. And we asked them what the priorities were, and sort of number one was education, number two was employment, when we asked it at the height of lockdown, housing was number one. And, housing has become this conduit. It's become not only a source of mental health and anxiety, it's also become a real barrier to work and employment. And I think that's about the cost rising up. And just lastly, I'd say when it comes to unpaid internships, we also asked if they could afford it with sort of lunch expenses and expenses. And it kind of changed the dial a little bit, but actually young people kind of overwhelmingly need to be kind of paid hourly by London Living Wage, or at least minimum wage, for them to be doing these opportunities. That's what they said.
Okay, James, did you want to come in?
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to build on that a little bit as well. So we're talking about work experience in a quite traditional sense in a way as well here, and we're talking about internships. But I think it's really important to recognise that catching young people early and giving them experiences of the world of work is really important. And what I mean by that is, so our remit is 11 to 18. We believe, as does the Gatsby Foundation, and we follow their advice on this, that from year 7, young people should be being exposed to the world of work appropriately so that they can start to build up their knowledge and understanding at that point, and they can start understanding the skills and the pathways and the qualifications that are required for those pathways that they might start identifying. I completely concur, and in terms of the barriers that exist around internships, but there's also lots of opportunities whilst you're still in the education system that shouldn't cost young people a huge amount. There may be some costs attached, I recognise that, but it's important that it's built on year throughout the education system, and that careers education isn't just seen as a bolt-on. It's not about you have a careers advisor and they give you an interview maybe once a year. It needs to be embedded within the curriculum, needs to be embedded within the schools and colleges, so that young people are developing their skills through core curriculum and not just as a bolt-on to look at what they're going to do as they move on at transition points. So I just wanted to come in on that point.
Okay, thank you. Did you want to come in quickly?
Yes, Chair. You said for me to ask this afterwards when I was asking my questions, but you've allowed Assembly Member Garrett, and my question does relate specifically to careers guidance. I wonder if I could just ask them now. And also, are we not expecting the Deputy Mayor as well?
That's why I delayed you, so you could ask him the bulk of those questions as well. So maybe I'll just let...
Okay, all right.
One question to go, and this is for Jonathan Cribb. We mentioned the hybrid approach earlier, and this probably will be a particular skill and type of training that is probably needed for older Londoners. I'd want to know if you'd agree with that, and also is there a particular difference between older men and older women? Jonathan?
Yeah, I don't... So, there may be some differences between older men and older women, but the main... but they're a lot less than they used to be. Women's employment rates are coming up a lot compared to men's, to kind of meet men's. I don't think that there are particularly a set of particular issues with regard to finding jobs that affect older women compared to older men, other than just generally the gender differences in the labour market. I think it might be slightly harder for older women to re-find work after they're made unemployed than older men, but it is not a kind of dramatic.
Why is it slightly harder for older women to find work than older men? And what skills and training do we need to provide for them?
Yeah, the key difficulty with older people, whether they're men or women, and training, is that the great thing about training younger people is that they have a long working life for that training to pay off. And while it is also valuable, well, it's incredibly important for older people to be able to work if they are able to. The kind of rationale for completely retraining or changing direction, in your early 60s, for example, when a lot of people are going to retire by 66, it is harder to do that. I don't know in terms of hybrid working. I guess the only thing is there are two key barriers to hybrid working. One is actually having the technological skills, information technology, which might be a little bit harder for older people. The second is having the space, particularly in London, actually, the space within one's home to work in a way that's not interrupted. Now, often that's talked about around children and schooling and remote schooling, but that also exists for particularly Londoners in overcrowded accommodation, or potentially for some of the older people in multi-generational households. It is very hard to think about a policy option that can actually help a lot around that, because it's a symptom of housing problems in London that go much wider.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for the answers. But before we move on to Assembly Member Marina, I'd like to welcome the Deputy Mayor, Jules Pipe. Jules, I don't know if you're still there, but you appeared and disappeared. There you go. Nice to see you, Jules. Thank you. And look, just before we move on, with a third of people over 50 return to work after losing their job, and if you compare that to people between 35 and 49, over half of them will return to work. When you consider the impact on a person's socio-economic group, when you consider that aspect as well, these facts still bear out. Do you think then, and I direct this to Michelle and to Jules, do you think more needs to be done within the Mayor's skills agenda to tackle this statistic? Because older people have a very specific challenge of changing role, of returning to work. Their stats are very low on that. Do you think we need to? The Mayor needs to do more to tackle that statistic, because the worry is now there'll be a number of older people in London who will lose their job and then just not be able to get back into work. You're on mute, Jules.
Yeah. First today. I mean, yes, it is something that we would want to address. I mean, the stats show that those engaging with training in London are at the younger end of the spectrum. It's broad. It goes. I mean, it's something like almost 2/3 of the people involved in AEB courses in London are aged between I think 18 and 49. So that's clearly at the younger end of the spectrum. But part of the focus of the Skills for Londoners work that we've embarked on, and also that of the changes that we've made to address the recovery mission, Good Work for All. The focus is very much in helping those who are either furthest from the labour market, those who want to get back into work, or those who want to reskill, who are recently unemployed. I mean, that's a key focus, and there isn't any artificial age limit
Sorry to cut you off.
Applied to that.
Sorry to cut you off there, Deputy, but if I take your two parameters furthest from the employment market and need to reskill, you're almost automatically identifying those older people. And given there's no recovery mission for older Londoners, do you think the Mayor should commit to a target for older Londoners in the skills agenda, because they satisfy, unfortunately, the two criteria that you just gave?
I think Michelle wants to come in there. Before she does, I would say that I would steer clear of targets, which would be somewhat artificial. And I think that if the missions cover all bases, such as I believe they do, I mean, as you rightly just pointed out, that the key focus of of the priorities would address older Londoners. I'm not sure what introducing further things for older Londoners would. It sounds to me like duplication. But I think Michelle perhaps wants to come.
Yeah, I was just going to add to some of the work we're doing around older Londoners, because there is a huge amount of work we're doing. So just to look at the adult education budget, which is by far the largest revenue budget that the GLA has, and is focused on skills. In the last academic year, we had nearly 61,000 Londoners aged over the age of 50 participating in adult education courses. So we're obviously attracting those age groups as well. We also, through our recovery missions, we've been working with various different stakeholder groups. I believe we've been talking in particular, I think it's to Age UK, about how we can be reflecting the needs of older Londoners within our recovery missions, in particular in relation to good work. So as at the moment, we're establishing the different programmes that fit within there. Quite rightly, there's been a big focus on young Londoners, and I think we heard that at the beginning of this session about how young Londoners in particular have been affected by the pandemic. But we are also trying to make sure that we are covering the breadth of those Londoners that have been most affected by the pandemic. So there are certainly activities embedded within some of the programmes we're looking at about how do we support those older Londoners who may actually be looking to reskill much later in their careers for those last sort of few years of that as well.
Thank you. I just want to make the point. This isn't a competition between young and old people. I know that isn't what you're pointing to, but I do want to make the point that older people have a very particular challenge. And although the Deputy Mayor has no enthusiasm for a target, fair enough, I do think they should be explicitly named in the recovery mission, because if you're an older Londoner and you lose your job, you are under a very serious set of circumstances that a younger person might find more help with. But thank you. I'm going to move on to Assembly Member Ahmed.
Thank you very much, Chair. So if we backtrack slightly to go back to the discussion about careers guidance, and this is, and good morning panel, it's great to see you. A question specifically for Matthew and Deputy Mayor Pipe. As you know, the Education Act in 2011 placed the duty of independent and impartial careers guidance for pupils over the age of 13 with schools. The evidence since then has indicated that this seems to have led to inconsistency in quality and availability of careers guidance for young people. Do you think Londoners could benefit from an independent pan-London careers guidance service? And if so, do you think this should be devolved to the Mayor of London?
Sorry, I'm not sure who you want to answer first. Happy to start.
So it was to you and to Matthew. So Deputy Mayor, if you wish to start.
Yeah, I would entirely agree with what I think with what you're suggesting about having a full careers advice and guidance service for the capital, well, indeed for the whole country, and I think it then should be devolved. And London would be the appropriate geographical area for us to manage such a service. The Mayor has pressed for such a devolved advice and guidance service since he's been in office. It's been a core ask of the Skills for Londoners programme. Meanwhile, though, we haven't just been lobbying for a better funded and a more comprehensive service. We have been trying to fill the gaps, notably with the lean. The GLA's managed that since 2016. And that works with careers leaders across London to try and build a comprehensive programme. As much as one is able to, on the basis that the backbone of it is effectively volunteers from business, and effectively the lean acts as a coordination service. But it has hugely, over the last 5 years, it has hugely increased the amount of coverage, so the number of schools and colleges that it engages with. And in recent years, we've seen increases in the Gatsby benchmarks as well, to much closer to the national average. So short answer, yes, we should have such a programme as you're suggesting, but meanwhile, we are providing a more comprehensive service than was there, and we are seeing improvements.
Yeah, and I think just to quickly add on what Jules said, I completely agree that I think actually the GLA can take that role. And for me, it's about that coordination. I mean, if we look at the problem, systems like the coverage of careers advice and guidance is very patchy from local authority to local authority. And having that kind of central regional coordination, one, allows it to kind of better link up with those kind of larger businesses and also link opportunities from outer London to inner London. And also address where job opportunities and work experience opportunities are cross-borough as well. So I think, you know, kind of linking it up regionally to kind of regional strategies and where we think London is going and looking at the sectors that are growing kind of strategically, I think is a much better idea than kind of 32 London boroughs kind of doing it differently between all the different schools. It can be quite difficult sometimes.
Thank you. What more do you think, and this is going to Matthew and to Deputy Mayor Pipe, what more can the government do to ensure quality and access for careers guidance for young people? And will this be more important given the potential unemployment that Londoners could face as a result of the pandemic? Jules, if you want to answer first.
If I can quickly go first on that, then. So I think, as one of the previous panelists was saying, something about early intervention. So when we're doing careers advice and guidance to the kind of younger, we can intervene and have that kind of ongoing conversation rather than a single intervention, I think would be good. We've talked about hybrid systems. Some people, the sort of blur between personal and work life and education with everything going digital, I think has made them kind of clamour for physical services. So in-person advice, I think, is really useful. And on top of that, it's not just formal education. Well, so you're seeing great work done with careers advice in sports venues and kind of through other activities, and that particularly works for certain groups as well. So thinking about a range of space and places, early intervention, and careers advice and guidance that's kind of meaningfully linked to the direction of London, to tangible work experience options as well. So it's not just an advice session, but it's also kind of a referral onto additional opportunities, additional work. And making sure that those opportunities are as local as possible, because, you know, certain younger age groups are less likely to kind of travel out of borough by train, etc.
I think it comes down to greater funding to create a more comprehensive service, as I say, not to rely on coordinated volunteers as we currently do. I mean, I think the volunteers are vital. I mean, they are people who have experience of business, active in business, and they're giving up their time to engage with education settings. That is a really good thing, an essential part of a career service, I think. But I think that we could do much more. I think, as Matthew says, earlier intervention. I think I've said to previous incarnations of this panel that that we should be taking primary school kids around education settings to kind of normalise the world of work. A sort of a rush in the last couple of years of secondary school or in further education is far too late. We should be normalising the world of work, and this isn't about trying to sort of railroad young people into choosing a particular career at the age of 8. It's actually the opposite. It's about trying to expose them to the wide breadth of possibilities and choices that they could have in later life.
Thank you. And this question for all the panel. And I appreciate it might be a little early, and given the background of the pandemic, to answer this, but I would like your thoughts on this. How much do you believe has Brexit and the impact of Brexit affected the careers, skills and guidance training of young people? Or not just young people per se?
Well,
Michelle,
what people
Michelle,
think, if I can jump in, I mean,
Jules,
certainly
it's
highlighted the need for greater intervention, because Brexit has clearly created a lot of skills gaps for employers. So we've got gaps in the in the market. Plus, we have a cohort of people who are becoming unemployed for whatever reason, as a result of the pandemic, and we need to match that willing workforce up with willing employers. But obviously, the gap in the middle is that advice and guidance as well as training.
Thank you. And Michelle, could you perhaps answer that next?
Yeah, I mean, I would just echo really what Jules has said. I think it's probably far too early to say how it's affected the careers advice that is given. We've got James, it's probably on the call, will probably be able to answer some of that better in terms of the volunteers that we have working with us on the programme. But we certainly know some sectors have been more significantly impacted than others in terms of people returning to their home countries and therefore leaving vacancies in specific sectors in London. In particular, the work that we've been doing over the last few months around hospitality has demonstrated that there are significant skills gaps, not only because of the pandemic, but because of Brexit, and therefore linking those skills gaps back through to the careers advice we're able to give young people is absolutely key.
James?
Yeah, and I think it's really important that we consider schools and colleges have a statutory duty to deliver, and they are autonomous institutions in themselves. So, hugely important to engage with schools and colleges to get them on board, make sure they're brought in at a senior level around careers education. I think we've got to be slightly careful when we talk about going back to a previous point in terms of patchiness. And it's really important from our perspective that we don't imprint an external service upon schools, but that we work with schools and colleges to ensure that they are also delivering on their statutory duties in terms of careers advice and guidance. I think there's also a point around labour market information as well. Post-Brexit, obviously labour markets will be changing due to Brexit, and it's really important that we keep abreast of that. We make sure that young people are aware of any of those changes, and that when we are communicating about labour market information, that we're aware of the audiences that we're communicating to, so that it is digestible, it is understandable, both by educational institutions and by young people themselves.
Thank you. Jonathan?
I don't know the answer to what the effect of Brexit is on these things. It's almost certainly very small compared to the COVID crisis at the moment. I mean, it might grow over time, but I don't know.
Okay, thank you. And Matthew?
I mean, sort of anecdotally, we hear a lot of young people now are fully aware of the fact that sort of working in Europe is a less likely kind of option for them. So they are thinking more domestically, more regionally, moving outside of London to find working opportunities. And the only thing which we might touch on is ESF funding and how that's going to affect the young Londoners.
Thank you very much. So moving on, we know that some groups are unrepresented in certain sectors, and whilst we clearly want to get a position of diverse and equal representation, we know that until we get there, we need targeted investment and support. For example, the Mayor sought to tackle the underrepresentation of women and Black, Asian and minority ethnic Londoners in the construction sector and tech workforce. Do these kinds of interventions work, and how else can the underrepresentation of Londoners from different ethnic backgrounds be tackled through skills and training?
If I may kick off, I think our experience with Mayor's Construction Academy so far has been very positive, particularly with minority ethnic candidates. There's been, the stats show that there's been a real shift there. It's been more of a struggle to increase female representation, and it hasn't got close to the target that we were hoping for. I'd have to check. I think our target was we were hoping for 20%, but I think we've only got around half that target. But I think it's proving itself that it does have merit to explore further, which is why we are looking to expand it across other sectors.
Thank you. And my apologies. I should have said at the beginning that the question was aimed at Matthew, Jonathan and James, but that then leaves Michelle out. So, Michelle, if you want to answer, and then perhaps the rest of you can.
I mean, again, just to echo really what Jules has said, I think the Academies programme, which is the sort of coming after the MCA activity that we did as well, I mentioned earlier, we'll have a significant stream of work, which is that bespoke support for employers to make sure that we're breaking down those barriers to employment for those groups that are underrepresented within their workforces. We're creating a series of toolkits. We are going to be doing some significant work with those employers within those hubs to make sure that we're able to break down those barriers. We know creative industries, which is one of the which is one of the academy focus areas, that is significantly underrepresented in terms of BAME communities within that sector. So that's something we really want to address through this programme and through partners. There's a real commitment to do that. And we know perhaps in some other sectors that we're focusing on, there are different challenges. So, for example, the green industries, people aren't going into that sector not because they don't think they can, but probably because they don't even know it exists and what are the roles within that. Within our wider programmes, we do really focus on tackling the lack of inclusion across all of our activity. The adult education budget, as I said, does really well at engaging those people that we would want it to. So women, those people from BAME communities, and those people earning below the London living wage are all key participants in that programme. What we want to then see, which we will be doing through our London Learner Survey and other activity, is how that participation is converting into jobs and into progression within employment. So it's absolutely something we focus through all of our activity. And that's before I sort of mentioned ESF, where we do some very specific programmes targeting very specific communities to ensure that we are helping them in the best way possible to get into good work.
Thank you. James.
Yeah, I mean, before we go on to sort of specifics of what we do, I think it's really important to recognise as well that the careers hubs that we'll be launching next year will be tying into these broader priorities that Michelle has been talking about. So, and I think that coordinating role is really important. More broadly, referring back to the enterprise advisors that Jules had mentioned, I think it's hugely important that the enterprise advisors that are going into those schools and either supporting senior leaders, career leaders, or young people directly represent and reflect the young people that they are supporting as well. Going back to that term, you need to see it to be it. So that's, for me, hugely important. And I'm happy to say in London we've got a real diverse range of enterprise advisors from a range of different sectors as well that can go in and represent, and that for us is hugely important, as well as where we are tying into cornerstones and other employers that we work with in London and nationally. Many of them have specific pieces of work that they're focused on, whether it be around STEM or STEAM, whether it be in the construction industry. There's a real drive there, and it is hugely important for us.
Thank you. Jonathan.
I think that what I'd add here is that I think thinking about what is, in terms of career advice, it's also about kind of not just careers, but kind of next step of education advice and what's, what's most appropriate, what's going to be the best option for different people. We see, considerably higher rates of women, young women, and of people from ethnic minority backgrounds going into higher education compared to white people and boys. Now that can sometimes reflect often reflect school performance, but even conditional on that, you see more ethnic minority people going into higher education, and I think those differences highlight kind of two challenges. One is that are there people from white backgrounds who maybe could benefit from a higher academic education who aren't doing it, or are there people from Black, Asian, minority ethnic communities who might be better in something other than higher education, for example, high quality apprenticeships or other forms of training. So those disparities are really complex, but where there are those differences, I think that it highlights careful thought over what the most appropriate and guidance over what the most appropriate next step of education is, as well as not just thinking about kind of the jobs that come on the end of it.
Thank you. Matthew, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, so I think sort of touching on Jonathan's point in particular, I mean, we kind of have the data around apprenticeship take-ups being very low in London. So for me, about going into those level 2, level 3 apprenticeships, what the offer is and how kind of within the London context we can kind of target specific groups or make apprenticeships a more appealing offer. I mean, we did a piece of research about 4 or 5 years ago looking in qualitatively perceptions that 16-year-olds had of their different options. And there's a real challenge there with apprenticeships in London, around seeing it as plan B, and actually one of the side things is around this idea of the lifestyle, but there's no real lifestyle communicated with apprenticeships. University is this sense of independence, finding yourself, living alone, while apprenticeships is kind of seen as low paid, hard work, and this, offer, that was communicated by the government at the time of, well, if you earn this amount if you go to level 3 or 2, that was kind of crashing up against kind of the wages that young people are aware of when you first start an apprenticeship. I think there's a real trouble there, and I think that's the best way. And looking at the Mayor's Construction Academy, is about how can we look at programs like that and what they've done around communicating the difference, the quality, the value, and how can we apply that to other apprenticeship programs.
Thank you very much. My final question is for James and Matthew. We've spoken about the economic impact on disabled Londoners. I'd like to focus on skills and training needs. What are the specific needs of disabled Londoners with regard to skills and training to ensure that programmes are accessible and beneficial, and how has COVID changed any of these needs?
So if I could just start. So, I mean, the main thing for this, and this is before COVID, but definitely kind of shifted. One of the main things is around travel training. So we did a report called Transport, Employment and Disability, which looked very specifically at the challenges that disabled young people have in terms of accessing and actually the level of support that employers need to either provide, or local authority or the employment support programs around travel training, getting young people comfortable with using the tube and the various challenges that brings. So kind of one of the recommendations is stressing the importance of travel training, understanding the additional requirements and support for them, and also, and this is a side note, but around the Freedom Pass as well, and kind of linking that up and coordinating that regionally, because I know that different local authorities have different requirements for the Freedom Pass. So we found that parents of young disabled children were having to go through different hoops or try to prove a different level of need, and that caused a lot of confusion. Yeah, that's the main one, I think.
Thank you, James.
I'm afraid I'm not in a good position to be able to come back on that particularly. I'm not sure if other members of the panel would have broader insight there.
Okay, Jonathan?
Not really, I'm sorry.
Okay, anybody else? Last call? Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, panel. Thank you, Chair.
Assembly Member. I'd like to move on to Assembly Member Polanski.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you, panel. Good morning. This has already been a really insightful discussion. Looking forward to it continuing. My first question is for Jonathan. The question is about the Centre for Ageing Better looked at some of the problems for older Londoners getting back into work, and one of the things that was really identified was low confidence and aspiration once they'd left the job market and returning to it. So my question to you, Jonathan, is what is being done specifically for these older Londoners to boost confidence and re-find aspiration?
Wow, I don't I don't know. Well, I mean, the key way the government interacts with job seekers is through the job centre, right?
that interaction has been harder during the COVID crisis. The kind of way the job centres work has been different, and particularly, I think one of the particular challenges there, given that job centres are the key interaction that job seekers have with finding with government, is that a lot of the kind of jobs that job centres place or help to place people with are the kind of jobs that might actually be shrinking in the kind of current climate, particularly the retail and hospitality kind of jobs. Not exclusively, but there are a lot of those kind of roles that are kind of advertised through job centres. So I think that, some real thought, and maybe this is a more central government issue, but I think that real thought needs to go into how job centres interact in a world where the kind of jobs that they usually help place people with are shrinking, even if overall there is increasing numbers of vacancies. But in terms of exactly who's doing what to boost people's confidence, I'm not exactly sure.
No, that's really helpful, Jonathan. It sounds like there's lots of work to be done on looking at how we can specifically boost people's confidence, and maybe there is a gap in the market there. Continuing on the same theme, I'd like to ask Matthew a question. I entirely agree with what the chair said earlier, that this is not about pitting young people against older people. They both have different sets of problems and different sets of solutions, although there are some similarities. So I want to continue asking about low confidence and aspiration, particularly in young people, but this could also intersect with people from ethnic minorities, people who have disabilities, or actually just anyone at all. What work would you like to see happening, Matthew, and where do you think there's a gap maybe in boosting people's confidence and aspiration?
Interesting. So, I mean, for me, there's two main things. The first one is kind of a one stone, two birds kind of thing, where when we're looking at the recovery missions and kind of employment programs and things like that, we talk about kind of putting young people at the heart of it. For us, it's about how we're involving young Londoners meaningfully in program design and, the decisions made about the services in their area. We think that involving young Londoners in that way actually does give benefits for them around confidence, engagement in their local democracy. And I think that's one way of building their confidence and skills. And I think the second one, and I think the GLA is kind of putting a lot of sort of focus on this, is around mentorships. We asked young Londoners about mentorships. Around a third of them already had mentors, but young people more likely to have a mentor if they went to private school. And actually, when we asked those who had mentors what they wanted them for, 50% of them had them for careers advice and guidance, and the other 50% had them for personal development. And the definition of mentor is interesting, but it's kind of that inflection point where outside of the formal education sector, when we talk about confidence, it tends to be where they take guidance and leadership from someone important in their lives outside of family. So we find this with young men in sport situations and settings. When it comes to youth services, it's kind of your local youth worker as well. It's having that face-to-face interaction. I think social anxiety and digital, I think there's a crisis growing there over the past year because everything's been digital. Cameras have been off in meetings, it's harder to kind of shy away. And actually a lot of work has to be done on how we're looking at building confidence in person setting once kind of the pandemic does hopefully subside.
Thank you, Matthew. That's a great answer there. Having been a youth worker, as other people in the chamber have as well, I absolutely endorse the value of having a really good mentor, and it'd be something I'd love us to see do more of. So a question for the Deputy Mayor. This is specifically about the green recovery. Now, if London is going to recover from the pandemic, as we all hope it will and will be pushing it to, it needs to recover in a different way. We need to move away from burning fossil fuels and a high carbon economy towards a low carbon economy that's based in community. What work is being done specifically to move towards this green recovery, particularly around skills and training matching where there might be new gaps in the market?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I think that probably a response to this issue that we've been looking at, obviously, is through the sector skills academies. And they're a core part of the Helping Londoners into Good Work mission, which is our response to COVID recovery. And one of the key sectors that we're looking at is green. We've consulted with many stakeholders in all the sectors, including green, to identify what the priorities are. So in terms of the green economy, we talked about construction, but there's a lot needing to happen in green construction, both to meet our zero carbon responsibilities, but specifically in things like energy efficient retrofitting to homes and workplaces, the construction of low carbon vehicles, but also the infrastructure that's needed for low carbon vehicles and active travel. Obviously, we're doing a lot, and we'll continue to do, obviously, with our partners in local government on green spaces, waste and recycling, and obviously there are there'll be plenty of green roles embedded within other sectors generally, in the same way that digital isn't just about writing code. There are digital jobs throughout all sectors. Similarly, I think we will become to realise that there are green opportunities, green jobs that need doing throughout the general labour market and other sectors. And so the Academy is mindful of that and looking to those areas within the green sector.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. Now, there's no environmental justice without social, racial and economic justice too. These things are intertwined. Some sectors will be under threat and need to be, but actually we can look at reinvesting those jobs into green jobs and a just transition. I'm thinking particularly maybe of the aviation sector, for instance, if we're reducing flights. What work is being done to predict or to manage making sure that people do have suitable jobs to go into and are being skilled or trained appropriately?
Well, we're doing a lot of work on data across the piece, looking at this. I don't know, Michelle, you want to come in on that, a lot of the work that's going on to identify the changing labour market?
Yeah, so we're doing a piece of work with, or I should say GL Economics, our colleagues in GL Economics are doing a piece of work to look at just what you've said. So where are the opportunities? Where are the opportunities in terms of entirely new sectors? Where are the opportunities within sectors which might need just a little bit of reskilling and actually you can go into them? And then actually looking at sort of greening everything. And there should be a green aspect to all of our work as we move forward. So we're doing some work around where those opportunities are likely to be so that we can work with our providers and others through our academies as well to make sure that we're helping people into those areas. We're also, in terms of the wider activity that we're doing, we've just commissioned £32 million of the adult education budget into our Good Work for All fund. And we focus that £32 million on the 4 key sectors that we believe are important for recovery, with green being one of those. And we were really keen to make sure that we were bringing in new providers to help support that work. Our colleges and infrastructure that we already have are brilliant at delivering across a range of things. But what we wanted was some of those new providers, independent training, private providers that can be agile and responsive and who are working in some of these more niche areas such as green industry to come in. And we're really pleased that we now have 20 new providers. There's 40 providers won contracts overall, but 20 new providers are coming in to help us deliver those ambitions as well. The other thing around green and green skills is we have asked all of the adult education budget providers, of which there are over 100, to set out delivery plans this year to demonstrate how they're going to deliver across each of the Mayor's recovery missions. And as you will all know, one of those central recovery missions is around the Green New Deal, which we again reflect within the Good Work mission that we've been talking a little bit about this morning. Our providers have all come back and we're just going through that analysis, but we're really pleased to see that they are all taking on that challenge and looking at how they can really reflect the mission statements and activities to make sure that provision is both meeting the needs of those employers that we've set out within the green sort of economy, but also looking at how we embed green skills across all of the activity that they do as well. And we'll be publishing some of that information shortly once we've gone through that.
Thank you very much, Michelle. I have lots of questions, but I'm mindful of time, so I will move on to the final 2 questions. This is for James Moon. What is the key to successful careers advice as London recovers?
I think the key, and we see this across the country and not just in London, is focusing on leadership and coordination for this. So, and when I talk about leadership, I mean it at various different levels. I mean leadership at the local level with the school. So empowering a careers leader, making sure they have the skills, the knowledge that they need, that they're trained appropriately, and they can make sure that careers advice and guidance is embedded throughout their school. I mean it at going one layer up in terms of a hub lead, so the hubs that we'll be setting up in London. Their role is to coordinate, to make sure, I think to Matthew's point earlier, that we don't look at it at just a borough by borough level, but we share best practice, we set up communities of practice and allow that to be shared across different schools and career leaders and not be boundaried. And I think leadership in terms of at the GLA, ensuring that the other wider strategic priorities for skills and the economy are embedded in the work that's happening around careers education, and then going up one step further for us nationally to make sure that we're driving consistency and quality across the country, and where we see really good practice in other parts of the country, that is brought in London and it's tested and then it's embedded as well. So for me, it is about that leadership at various different levels and that coordination at different levels also.
And just back to you, James, particularly on that issue of leadership, actually, how should the Mayor connect employers with skills and opportunities to get people into good work?
Sorry, could you repeat the question again?
Yeah, absolutely. How should the Mayor connect employers with good organisations for skills and opportunities to get back into good work?
So, I mean, bearing in mind our remit is 11 to 18, so students within education. One thing that we do have nationally is cornerstones, and cornerstones are leaders that represent their sectors, and they drive forward education, careers advice and guidance. I think it's really important that we're talking about the future here, because hubs are due to be set up in the autumn term of this calendar year. I think it's hugely important that we consider our cornerstones, the makeup of them, the representation of them, how they tie into those wider sectors, and really important that we consider the broader employers that we're engaging and making sure that young people get a real breadth of experience and understand the skills and knowledge for those different sectors as well.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for your answers, and thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Zach. Back to me. Deputy Mayor Pipe, I just want to labour the point around a recovery mission for older people. The conversation we've just had with Assemblymember Polanski focused on the fact in the beginning that older people, one of their biggest hurdles for getting back into work is just confidence, just the belief that someone is there for them, that they have value in the workplace. Surely a named project for them would be instrumental in helping rebuild that confidence. I accept your reluctance for a target, I accept that, but surely we should be having a focus on this very important part of our community that could potentially be wiped out by the pandemic.
Well, I'm happy to take it away and consider what gaps might exist, but I think that's what we need to see it in terms of what gaps, if any, exist in the way we are going about addressing the issue for the whole population. I mean, a lot, the titles of these programs are, such as Good Work for All. They're designed to cater for the full spectrum of people as they present, whatever their circumstances, whatever their ages. If there is a gap for a particular sector, be that older people, then I would happily take that on.
Thank you. I just make the point because I think when you identify a group of people, it increases the chance of them coming forward. Let me just quickly bring in Assemblymember Bakari.
Thank you. I'd very quickly, Deputy Mayor, as you're now back in the room, I really wanted to ask you and clarify something that Michelle said. She has warm words of support for the Disability Task Force. Will you set up the Disability Task Force, and when will that start happening?
I'm afraid that's beyond my knowledge at the moment to be able to respond to that. I'll have to write to you.
Please do write back to us as a committee and I'll distribute that information. But it's about, to be clear, the if and when a disability task force would be set up by the Mayor's office to look at the issues faced by disabled people across London. Am I correct in that? Thank you. So we look forward to receiving that. My next question goes to Michelle and Jules. Please feel free to pipe in, both of you. What is a green job? How will you define a green job? It appears large in the Mayor's manifesto. We've had lots of warm words, but how would you tell a Londoner what a green job is?
Yeah, we have absolutely recognised that that's an issue at Skills for Londoners. At the recent board, we've got representatives from construction industry, for example, a key area within green issues and jobs. And that very discussion took place. The fact that what is green, what does that phrase mean to the general population? So we're very mindful that going forward that we need to, in taking forward all our myriad programmes, we need to, it is about communication. That's a big part of what we'll be doing in through the academies. It's as much a communications job as a coordination job in putting people together. But as I say, communicating what opportunities are out there isn't going to be achieved by just saying, come and get a green job. We need to give examples. We need to give particularly career examples, trajectories that people have taken, pathways that people have taken, showcase choices they've made in their qualification career and what that's led to and where they are now. I think it's kind of I think someone else earlier said kind of something similar to seeing is believing, seeing is doing, and that's what we need to do.
Yes, because what we wouldn't want is a relabeling of jobs. We need to understand the scale at which the Mayor hopes to provide these jobs, and of course, are they new jobs or not? It will be very important to this committee and many other committees going forward.
As Chair, I think much of it needs to be an expansion of existing jobs, as I say, particularly in terms of construction, energy efficient retrofitting. That's clearly something that's not so much inventing new jobs, but increasing the number of jobs in that sector. But I think there will also be new jobs created. 10 years ago, the installation of car charging points probably wasn't thought of as an existing job, and we've probably got to do a lot of things like that in the infrastructure sector. So I think it will be a mix of expansion and some new, and also identifying roles within existing sectors that need to address environmental, green, whatever one wants to call it, issues. As I said, I think the comparison can be made to digital, whereas often people talk digital. What is that? Is it sitting at computers and joining up computers and working in IT? No, digital goes throughout everything we do these days, and so there's a digital role in all sectors. It's likely that something the one can make comparisons with green jobs as well, being throughout all industries in the future.
Yeah, okay, I think the challenge lays with you, Deputy Mayor, to make sure these things are clearly defined so that we can measure and pursue the best practice. Let me slightly move you on. Does the 2018 Skills for Londoners strategy need a fundamental rethink to align itself with the missions and the challenges we now face?
Well, I mean, the headlines of the Skills for Londoners strategy, I think, are still as relevant as today as they were then. But obviously, we have moved on, not least because of the pandemic. There is the Helping Londoners into Good Work mission, which of course is about the skills academies, the no wrong door approach that we're taking with partners in local government and Job Centre Plus, and obviously the continued ongoing tailoring of how we spend the AEB budget, and some £330 million a year, and encouraging shifts in how that is spent with our partners in the colleges and the independent providers. And of course, we're now consulting on the roadmap as well, which is asking providers and communities across London about what they need from the future adult education budget.
Does all of that constitute a rethink though? Because we know we now live in very unique circumstances. We've had Brexit, we've had industries retract from an employee point of view. We're obviously trying to answer the pandemic and all the challenges that presents. Is this a rethink?
I think considering it as a rethink is purely presentational. I mean, I don't think of it as a rethink because I've always said, and certainly to this committee and its predecessors and the Education Committee, that ideally a skills system is dynamic and it adapts to the needs of the society it's trying to serve. I've often said, as I say, to Assembly members, that the problem, with an approach to skills is, as in the past, has been trying to pick winners, identify that as the thing everyone ought to be getting into, coming to that conclusion way too late, then having to embark on accrediting certain courses for the sector to be satisfied that those courses do what they want. And then, 5 years after the skills gap has been identified, then some courses begin to come on stream, and the system needs to be far more dynamic than that. And I think that the way that we've been adapting over the last 5 years, the way things pivoted so quickly in response to the pandemic, and as we are now to the recovery, I think that being fleet of foot and that adaptability is how it should be. I don't think it should be seen as a kind of like, a sudden crunch of the gears and a change in direction. It should be adapting to whatever the needs are that are required.
Thank you. I appreciate the answer. I do see your point that you shouldn't keep rethinking. You should have a process that is constantly evaluating its effectiveness. I accept that's a good answer. Thank you very much. I'd now like to move on to Assembly Member Bakari.
I don't think it is me.
Sorry, I'm looking at the wrong set of questions. Excuse me. It's Garrett, Assembly Member Garrett. Excuse me.
We're easily confused. I'd like to, I think, partly come back to something we've covered, but I think there's a part of it that we've missed. So it's partly about listening to employers, and it sort of follows on from what we were just talking about, really. And I suppose the question I got down here was about how does the GLA's skills team work with London's employers to identify skills gaps. I suppose what I would add on, picking up some of the points earlier about the pandemic and about Brexit, both anecdotally and in the media, I'm seeing a lot of talk about particularly lower skilled work that has often been filled by migrant workers. There's now fewer of those people, more of a skills gap in those areas. How are we making sure that we actually know where they are? Because it seems to be changing quite quickly. So how do we know that, for example, chefs, I'm hearing there's vacancies for chefs. Are we sure that we have training in place for those vacancies?
Yeah, well, Michelle's mentioned a lot of work that's done through with GLA Economics about pure data, but we also work very closely through the skills team with employers, and also through various bits of the GLA with the sectors that are relevant to our areas. So, for example, the Deputy Mayor for Culture and her team will be very close to cultural and creative industries. We've formalised interaction as well a bit through the Skills for Londoners programme, both representation on the Skills for Londoners board, and also there have been and continue to be various business boards in which sector representatives are present. So whether Michelle wants to add detail on that at all.
Yeah, sure. So we have a sort of formal group, which is the Skills for Londoners Business Partnership, which is entirely made up of business members or leaders from across a range of sectors that are important for London. I should say that probably every single programme we design, we do it in partnership with our business community. So a really good example of that, and we've spoken quite a lot about it this morning, but it is the Academies programme. Each of those sectors that have been identified, we've spent a significant amount of time working with partners in business to make sure that we're actually addressing the things that they're concerned about. There is no point us putting out an Academies programme in the range of sectors that we think it might work if we didn't have the buy-in of those sectors. Most recently, we had a hospitality roundtable, specifically because of the impact, well, actually the dual impact, I should say, of COVID and Brexit on that sector, and the importance of hospitality to London's economy. Within that, we explored a little bit about some of the things you were saying there: low pay, low wages. Traditionally, they have a lot of employees who are from communities from across Europe. Those people aren't necessarily still here. They have huge skills gaps, and how can we address that? So through our Academies programme, we are really looking to join up our skills providers, our local authorities, our Job Centre Plus colleagues, with the business community to make sure that we're filling those vacancies with skilled people, and also really importantly showing the career paths through some of those sectors. We know some of the sectors we're focusing on through the academies have traditionally not been sectors people look at. They don't necessarily want to go into hospitality, for example, because they don't think it's a career path that's right for them. What we want to be able to do is really promote the benefits of these sectors in terms of offering good work and the possibility of career progression, fairly swift career progression, actually, when we were thinking about hospitality within that as well. But no, just to reiterate, we work incredibly closely with the business community on the development of each of the programmes that we work on.
Actually, again, following, I think, Jules, you had quite a slightly sort of graphic example of, you know, a skills program lumbering on slowly after a change 5 years later, sort of finally arriving with something that was, you know, late and wrong and no longer necessary. So just to sort of...
Sorry, not so much a specific program, but more just like a general approach in the country, you know,
yes.
the skills system has been known to be not as responsive as we want it to be.
No, I think that was fair. I suppose you've spoken in broad terms, both of you, about how it's different. So I suppose in terms of timeline, I think the timeline you had there for our sort of lumbering beast of an approach was about 5 years. With the super agile approach that we're talking about now, how long is that? What's the sort of turnaround from identifying to...
Well, I mean, we're hoping to get the academies up and running towards the end of the year, aren't we, Michelle? I would still say, though, that there are still issues, you know, nationally that we need to grapple with in terms of, I mean, a specific instance would be the accreditation of courses. And that's something that continues to be an issue, that if say in green industries there's someone needs really identifies the need for a particular qualification in retrofitting, for example, these things can take time because various accreditation bodies, you know, consultation with industry, the course satisfies their requirements. Unfortunately, those things are still issues. But where we are being, I think, effective at a regional level and other devolved regions are that, you know, we're tapped into the local, you know, the local interface where people are actually dealing with unemployed people looking for skills training, looking for jobs. And so the Academy's response, the Hub's response that Michelle's talked about, and the no wrong door approach, those are things that we can implement quickly at a local level.
So just
add
on
to that as well, just in terms of some of the activities. So I think it's fair to say when we talk about FE, when we are planning FE, it will take a year of planning before we get into actually seeing those results. So that is the nature of the way FE works. However, I think the fact that the pandemic has shown that our FE colleagues have been able to move incredibly fast to adapt to the changes that they've seen. If you think pre-pandemic, hardly any learning was done online. We can see through participation rates over the last year, huge amounts of learning has gone online, and they had to change that overnight. Colleges were closed, they had to shift to online learning, and that has really shown their adaptability. I think some of the other things that we have introduced through the devolution of the adult education budget is things like introducing non-accredited training allowances for FE colleges, which didn't have that ability to put before. So now colleges have 10% of their budget where they can use more agilely to support either the needs of individual perhaps sectors in their areas. That funding isn't tied to qualifications as such, and means that it can be far swifter in terms of its deployment and the ability to support people. So I think the pandemic in some ways has sped up
or slowed down
government to address some of these things. It's been hugely beneficial.
And I think some things like that, particularly the 10% flexibility, speaks to some of the earlier questions we had about raising people's confidence as well, because a lot of the kind of provision that colleges are seeking to provide through that 10% are sort of really basic core skills that would raise people's confidence. And also another good example, I think, is the amount of work that we've been doing on ESOL as well, and people's confidence with the English language. So again, those are kind of barriers to people having for work or go for higher level work.
Thanks. So I think a sort of final bit I'd like to pick up is about the adult education budget, and we've spoken a bit about on the employer side how we can feel confident that what we're trying to provide is what employers want. Just touching on whether that's what job seekers or potential trainees want. I suppose the question is, how would we assess whether the way the mayor is allocating the adult education budget is optimal for what we're trying to achieve?
Well, in an ideal world, and this is my opportunity to say, in an ideal world, the government would have a system where anonymized data that tracks people from primary school through secondary, through what they do after that, through to their job outcomes by joining up the DFE data, the DWP data, HMRC data, all based on national insurance numbers, anonymize it all, and then have number crunchers crunch that, and then we would have a brilliant idea about exactly what investments were paying off in terms of job outcomes. That would be my number one ask out of the system, but there are various barriers to doing that, which shouldn't take up our time now. What we are doing, though, in the absence of that, is embarking on a London Learners Survey, and that will attempt to look at the pathways that people have taken, the success that learners have felt that they have had in undertaking a course, an AEB course, and it will be looking at both terms in terms of academic outcome and qualifications, but also for those for certain courses it will be about well-being, and actually across the piece, actually even well-being can come about through also getting qualified and getting into work, but it actually goes across the piece. So that survey, we've already done the pilot. We're embarking on the full survey later in this year. We would have done started earlier, but obviously COVID got in the way, and we would have had a very distorted picture of the activity that was being undertaken by learners.
Just before we move on, would it be possible to have some appraisal of your pilot to see how it worked? Because you seem to be happy with it because you're moving on. It'd be nice for the committee to understand what the pilot was about, how effective it was seen, etc., etc. Thank you very much. Because, of course, your first answer, Jules, sound very much like the first step to social engineering, tracking us from cradle to grave.
Monitoring to see what works.
Well,
That's what we need to know. Because the thing is that it's not just about knowing that if someone took the classic example, they went to further education and they did a hairdressing course. But then all you know is that they didn't get into hairdressing or it was oversupply or something like that. But actually, if the customer care skills they learnt in that course ended up them getting a job in some other sector, well, job done. That's a success. But that kind of the subtleties of inputs and outputs and outcomes. Destination data for people and linking that up with the education path that they took, it would enable us to identify what works in the system and do more of it.
Your example is far more subtle than your first explanation. But you and I could take this conversation offline, because setting up a system that tracks from cradle to grave with all my life outcomes sounds slightly terrifying to me. But hey, we'll talk about that in the pub, Jules. Thank you.
Yeah, I was.
In defence of the Deputy Mayor, he did say anonymised, and actually there's a direct comparison with what's happening with the NHS data, which is also supposed to be anonymised. Just putting that out there. And I'm happy to join you in the pub.
And also, I think I should say that the government does have some of this data and does join it up in this way. Yeah. It just won't share it. And then, as I say, I'm not asking for personalised data. I'm asking, happy to have it in aggregate, but it's just what are the outputs of that data? What does it show as far as what works and what doesn't work? So people in government see this data, but we don't.
Might I retrieve us from the potential black hole of data and tech that we're about to enter and bring us back to the educational budget?
Okay.
I had you interrupted before I finished.
I'm going to bring us back to Assembly America. I've clearly touched the nerve. But to be
this
is
where
clear,
the digital skills comes in handy.
I think we'll take this one offline. But go ahead, Assembly Member.
Yes, I mean, just to put my colours to the mast, I'm not a big fan of Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, which we seem to be drifting towards. My question was going to be, though, really, if I was slightly lost in a big diversion about the benefits of sharing data. But if the Mayor is spending his adult education budget on the wrong things, how would that come to light? How would we know that that's happening?
Yeah.
How do you prove a negative?
Well, I mean, you can put. I'll rephrase it in a positive way. How would we identify the opportunity cost of the things we're not doing because we're spending it on something else? Is that an easier question? It's probably not, is it?
No. I mean, obviously we can. I think it's just looking at top line data in terms of gaps in are we filling gaps? Are we successfully filling gaps in those sectors that have them? I think the learners survey will go a long way to identifying whether the money is being spent well. As to whether it could be spent better, I mean, one can always spend more, spend better, spend more wisely. I mean, it's a difficult question to answer.
Would it be helpful for me to outline how we do spend the money, I suppose, and how we allocate funding?
That may help, because of course it's slightly distressing that this question is so hard to answer, because for us as a committee, we need your KPIs, your milestones to scrutinise, and if they're not plain to see, that leaves the committee and by extension London with a big problem around 330 million.
So I think I can probably answer that. So we produce quite a lot of data on the adult education budget. We produce 2 reports a year. We've currently got out, and I can share the link with you afterwards on the data store, the full data for the 19-20 academic year. And that shows how we spent the money. It shows who the participants were, which I think when you look at the participants, you would say broadly, yes, these are the right people we should have been working with. Those are, as we've all said this morning, 2/3 of those are women. We have really good representation from our BAME communities. We're hitting the different localities in about the right way. We also have there within the information around the sectors that funding is spent predominantly within and what kind of levels of qualifications we're spending with that in. We compare that to the national benchmarks, and I think you'll see that London does significantly better across many of those. We're also about to publish the first 6 months of this academic year's data. There's always a slight lag on this because the volume of Londoners we're working with, or the volume of data and the participants. So the first 6 months of this academic year's data, which takes us up to January, is going to be published in the next week or so. And again, that will be on the London data store, and we can share all of that with you. It has a breakdown of all the different characteristics, where those learners are, what they're undertaking. So we've got a lot of information that we use. We're also looking at that. We've inherited a system that doesn't have any benchmarks. It doesn't have any kind of measures of success other than the number of people that have undertaken qualifications. What it doesn't do is tell us how useful those qualifications have been in terms of getting Londoners into work, or helping Londoners' mental health, or various other outcomes that we would want it to see. So in terms of us inheriting a system, we can give you the facts, but what we're trying to do through the London Learner Survey is then move us on a journey to actually shift that to look at the outcomes. So learning is fantastic, but it's only useful if it's giving us the outcomes that we're looking for. And the London Learner Survey has identified 8 outcomes, 4 economic, 4 social outcomes, done with a huge amount of consultation across the sector and with various stakeholders to come to those outcome conclusions. And we want to then be able to measure the learning that is undertaken based on those outcomes. So if we find loads of people are doing a particular qualifications, I don't know, in construction, and it's not leading to any of them getting any work, well, the question has to be raised, why are we funding that? What's the use of that qualification, those areas of activity? But that's a journey, and that's going to take us some time to get there. We're also looking at delivery plans. So we set providers a series of objectives on an academic year basis. This year we've said, tell us how you're responding to the Mayor's Recovery Programme priorities. And those providers are coming back to us, as I said earlier, with setting out how they're meeting out those priorities. We will then be working with them to ensure that those priorities are being delivered through the adult education budget. And as I said, we're going to publish some of that information later this year as well. The other thing that we're doing is utilising the different funding streams that we do have, is linking job outcomes very squarely with our academies work. So we'll be introducing a job outcome payment for those adult education providers that are working in a hub on the academies programme, to very clearly link the intervention they're making in terms of skills training with a job outcome through that hub activity as well. So I suppose we inherited an imperfect system, and we're desperately trying to move it through to the outcomes. But we do publish a lot of data, and I'm happy to share that with everyone afterwards as well.
Assembly Member Garrett, I'm going to bring you to an end there. I can see that Assemblymember Sakina is a bit perturbed that we seem to have strayed deeply into her territory.
Deeply is definitely the right word, Chair, but thank you for
I can only apologise for
that.
I'm not in control of every aspect of this. Can I just say, you might want to discover what's been happening in a 5-year period up till now around these measurements, but I give you Assembly Member Sakina.
Thank you very much, Chair. I mean, I can see, for instance, why the Economic Committee did want to go into details around skills, because obviously Al Mayor Sadiq's mantra has been jobs, jobs, jobs in terms of the recovery for London, but also has been keen to make sure that Londoners have the skills to prosper. And I think that as we transition into the recovery aspect of this pandemic, absolutely skills should be at the reskilling, and making sure Londoners have those skills to prosper should be at the heart. So I can see why we've really got into the teeth of this conversation in the Economy Economy Committee, and I'm sure, apologies to the panel, perhaps some of these questions might be seeming like we're kind of drilling down into the same thing, but I think these are topics that Londoners are incredibly interested in, and to that end I might stray back into territory that has been slightly covered, and feel free to refer to answers that you have already given. And actually, one thing I would say is, Michelle, I was really pleased earlier that you referred to Age UK. I had the pleasure of meeting them last week, and they're really excited and interested in the adult education budget as an absolute core part of how we ensure that older Londoners, or indeed all Londoners, but particularly the underrepresented older Londoners, are given the opportunity and the capacity to be reskilled back into work. I think we've already heard right at the beginning, so full circle for the committee, about how the effects on young Londoners in terms of the frequency in which they lose jobs, and the precarity of the gig economy in compounding that. But particularly for older Londoners, perhaps those over 55, once they lose their job, it's incredibly hard for them to get back into the employment market. And actually, I think one thing that Age UK brought to my attention in positive ageing and age-wise, which is the ageism that has kind of rocketed, or the cases and tribunals around those, especially over 55, who are experiencing ageism, is of a real concern. So I'm really excited and really pleased that obviously with the Skills Academy, the adult education budget, that the GLA is really focusing in on how we can ensure that we take up that 28% that currently 50 plus have engaged with the skills academies, and the adult educational budget can go up and up. So I suppose, Michelle, you've spoken already at length about the delivery, the data, and particularly the London Learner Survey, which will be producing results soon. So I think I kind of want to adapt my question a little bit, rather than looking at what our KPIs and targets might be, to say, how can we ensure that the London Learner Survey is a success? What can we do as a committee? How can we ensure that actually the data that we accumulate is excellent? And just also touching on something that Jules spoke about, I mean, you mentioned well-being as one of the kind of targets or ways of assessing the results, and I really like that, actually, because I know that one of the criticisms we've sometimes heard of GDP as a component of understanding economic growth is it doesn't take, so for instance, your happiness into account. And actually, I think well-being, especially after the pandemic, is something that I think people realise is absolutely essential to how we flourish as human beings. So, Michelle, if I could start with you and then move on to Jules, please.
Sorry, so I was listening to all of that, and I'm just trying to get, what would you specifically like to focus on?
I guess two things. So firstly, with the London Learner Survey, what can we do as a committee to ensure that we continue collecting the data that makes sure that the results reflect the needs of Londoners, and how we can continue to improve our adult education budget? And secondly, could you give us a little bit more information about some of those analysis of that data? So Jules mentioned well-being, you also mentioned for social and for economic measures. So if you could go into a little bit more detail around that, that'd be great.
Yeah, sure. So I suppose, the success of the learner survey has to be down to learners knowing that there's a survey to complete, and for them to be encouraged to complete it. We will be contacting every learner that undertakes a qualification from the start of September. We're using a range of different methods, because we know that our Londoners that are undertaking qualifications are at very different paths. Some are digitally enabled, some really aren't, and that's part of what the adult education budget does. It tries to address those who aren't engaged or are disadvantaged. So I suppose the support from the Assembly about talking about the London Learner Survey, and if you're coming into contact with your constituents and Londoners, is if they are undertaking adult learning, we would really value them filling in the questionnaire that we've sent out. There's been a huge amount of work and testing on this over the last 18 months. We're the first part of the country to try this. And the piloting, which we'll send you more information on, has been successful so far. It was on the lower end of respondents, but that is to be expected, because we were sort of in the middle of a pandemic at the time, but also because we haven't been really shouting about it probably as loudly as we could do, and we will certainly be doing that from September. So we'd really value your support in making sure that Londoners are aware of the survey, and if they are engaging in adult education, that they respond to that as well. In terms of what we're measuring, so there's 8 indicators that we're looking at, and these are the very traditional economic indicators, which, as Jules mentioned earlier, actually government does have the ability to do this through the LEO data, but doesn't share that with us particularly regularly, and it has a long lag. So we're looking at 4 key areas, which is effectively getting people into work, progressing people, if they're already in work, progressing them within work, progressing them onto further education, And I've completely forgotten the fourth one around that. It's a very clear economic indicator. I'll dig those out so you've got them after this meeting as well. The social indicators were much harder because how do you measure learning? What we know is the adult education budget isn't just about getting people into work. That's a huge part of it, but actually adult learning in its entirety has so much value. So I was talking to one of our colleges yesterday who was saying they are working with students who don't have the ability to come into college anymore due to terminal illness or other issues. And actually online learning through some of their more creative subjects has been an absolute lifeline to those individuals to make them feel part of the community and stop their isolation. So we wanted to really capture the benefits of adult learning in its entirety, not just around economic value, although we would argue actually those social benefits also have an economic benefit because, for example, if we're helping someone's well-being or their social isolation, hopefully that then supports the fact that they're perhaps not drawing on other resources, perhaps through the NHS or others. So there's a real interconnectivity between economic value that isn't just about jobs, but about the economic value of learning in its entirety.
Absolutely. Sorry, I think you were about to continue, but I was just going to say, before Jules comes in, I might even just pick up on that particular point, actually, because I think you've really hit the nail on the head in terms of us expanding and being innovative about the way that we measure economic growth, for instance, and actually well-being. And like you said, how do you measure learning or how do you measure confidence is incredibly important, because actually if our well-being has increased, for instance, if our mental health is stronger, we are more likely to, want to go out and socialise, spend money in restaurants and actually help boost the economy. We're more likely to go into work. We're more likely to encourage other people in our work, in our social place to, come into the office as and when it's appropriate given COVID restrictions. So I think actually it sounds like from the London Learner Survey, we might be creating quite innovative indicators, and actually that could be potentially used as best practice for the government and beyond.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's just what we want to do. And in London, I think we have a real role in the fact that we are the only part of the country that has institutes of adult learning, for example. They don't deliver your traditional vocational qualifications, but they deliver a huge wealth of incredibly important courses and activities to help our communities. And what we need to be doing is shouting about the value of adult learning, not just in terms of getting people jobs, but actually in terms of people's well-being, their health, their confidence, and also other areas like engaging people in volunteering. Actually, that learning has led to them undertaking volunteering, which again helps their well-being and feeling of value in the community. So we are definitely banging the drum on that. We are the only part of the country measuring social outcomes, and certainly we know government is quite interested in this because it's not something they've looked at all before. And we're very keen that we do recognise the value of learning in its entirety to London.
Oh, that's fantastic. Michelle, I'm conscious of time, and I know that there's other members of our committee who haven't yet spoken, so I'm just going to sort of wrap up the rest of my questions into one, which is really this kind of bulk question, bringing us back to a conversation that we've been having throughout the committee around the Skills Academy and the Skills programme. And I mean, I guess for me during the pandemic, one of the conversations that I found most, inspiring in terms of, thinking about how we transition out of it was this idea of what does a new normal mean, and do we want a new normal, and do we need a new normal? And things like mutual aid groups showed us the strength of community organising in our local areas, but particularly for me, I think what the new normal spoke to was people saying there are huge levels of inequality across the country, internationally and in London indeed, and whether that's digital poverty or the exploitative nature of the gig economy, these things didn't come about because of the pandemic, they existed before that. And actually, as we transition out of the pandemic, not only do we need to undo the damage that took place to our economy because of COVID-19, but we need to address some of those underlying inequalities that existed. And I think Assemblyman Polanski spoke to the kind of the nature of the economy being high carbon and integrating this also into, as we transition, many people talk about a green recovery because I think we all know we're in a climate emergency. I mean, just the floods this week, which have really shaken London to its core, have really brought the climate emergency literally to our doorstep. So, our skills programme and our skills academies how do they address the inequalities that existed pre-pandemic, and how, coming back to the kind of green recovery, do they integrate, for instance, through the Green New Deal and the Green Skills Programme, a way of truly transitioning London into a green recovery? And I'll just quickly add, because I think it was a really interesting question posed by the chair in the conversation that we had in the committee about what is a green job. And I think a green job for me, and the trade unions have been doing fantastic work on this, so I hope we can, put them as, ensure that they're part of the stakeholders in this, which is workers in high carbon economies, be that aviation or any other aspect of the industries, when we transition them into new industries, it has to also be on their terms, and it has to also be moving away from that gig economy, exploitative nature of our economy. So it has to be well-paid, unionised, secure jobs. And actually, as we transition people out of that high carbon industry, a bit like what Jules was saying, there are going to be new types of green jobs that we create, because as we transition anyone out of a high carbon industry, for me, that is a green job. And perhaps we need to be bolder and innovative about what we define as a green job, ensuring that Londoners can be taken to that green recovery and that green future. So sorry, there's a lot of questions in there, but essentially ensuring our skills programme and our skills academies work for Londoners who were previously affected by low and disadvantaged economic circumstances pre-pandemic, and integrating the green recovery into that. So that can go to Jules, maybe Michelle, because I think I've taken a lot of your time actually already.
Already we know that more than 2/3 of learners funded through the AEB are women. More than half identify from minority ethnic backgrounds. Large proportion, 4/5 are either looking for work or are in work, but obviously seeking to progress. 15% of learners consider themselves to have either a learning difficulty or some sort of physical disability or long-term health problem. And there are stats to show a significant proportion are eligible for disadvantage uplift as well on the funding received for the course. So we know that it's targeted very much at those people most in need of help to take advantage of the labour market. What we're doing to increase that, there's a long list. We touched on a number of them today. I would think that the top 2 or 3 things that we've done would be extending full funding of AEB courses to Londoners earning below the London living wage. That has had a big impact. Providing greater flexibility for the FE sector to train their staff better to support learners with SEND is a significant thing. Probably most of all, I'd say, probably the biggest thing is probably that the first one I mentioned. But after that would be, I'd say, the fully funding of level 3 qualifications. The government does have a programme that addresses that, but you can't previously have had a level 3 qualification, whereas the London offer goes much further. So just because you might have a single A level in a subject that isn't helping you get a job isn't a barrier under the London scheme to be able to take a vocational level 3 qualification. And we've also obviously raised funding for core skills as well in maths and English. We've now expanded that to all level 2 qualifications. And of course, there's a lot of ESOL work that we have done, which we could discuss as well. But I don't want to take up your time, but there's a lot we could say about that.
Fab. Maybe Michelle wants to come in just on the green jobs and expanding the notion of what they might be.
So I think it comes back to what Jules was saying, I think to one of the earlier questions, it's defining what those green jobs are. Now, through our Academies programme, we've done a little bit of that, and we've provided a sort of definition of what we see as a green academy, sort of ranging from the retrofitting, waste, and then other sectors. There's a bit more detail on that, and again, we're happy to share all of that through. But I suppose what we're also asking is for the sector in itself to come forward and tell us what those jobs are, and for us to to work collectively with them. And part of the Academy's work is, and the point of them in certain sectors, is recognising that we haven't perhaps got the right provision that's meeting what the sector needs. The sector's moving so fast that we need to develop that provision alongside them. And so by bringing together business and providers to develop those qualifications or non-accredited training, we're able to develop that much further. And then I think there's a much wider piece that you were talking about, the general sort of greening of the skills sector. And I think that is something that we are looking at and committed to through some of the recovery work in terms of the anchor institutions, and the Association of Colleges in particular signed up to our anchor institutions charter. And one of the areas within that is ensuring that we are moving to a more a greener economy. So we will be working with those skills providers over the next years to ensure that we're doing that as well across every aspect. I think, as somebody said earlier, green environment is absolutely the sort of thread through all of the activity across the next few years.
Thank you, Michelle and Jules. Thank you, Chair.
Just before we move on, just a quick question. At the March 2021 Education Committee, you, Michelle, you said that the survey had to be delayed and we're going for a soft launch, I believe, in April 2021, and then a more comprehensive launch in academic year 21-22, which means the survey won't be available to almost 3 years after the adult education budget was devolved to London. I fully accept you couldn't control the pandemic, there's issues in there, but it does lead us to the question, what do you hope to learn from the survey? And also, do we run the risk of missing some of the learning because we're having to wait so long for the survey to be completed?
So I think, there's two issues, isn't there? I mean, one, we inherited a system which doesn't measure outcomes, and at the moment actually has no intention of measuring outcomes. So the way government measures the success is the number of people that have sat and undertaken a qualification. That may be great. They may well get jobs, and we would hope they would, because we hope our providers are supporting that. But we have no way of knowing whether they get those jobs. So when we inherited the adult education budget, one of the first things we wanted to do was not sort of focus on the volume of people we're churning through the system, but actually what's the impact of that education on their lives, and where's that taking them? So when we inherited this system, we really had to think about how we do that. We unfortunately have to work within a national system. The government owns the data. We don't own the data. Providers by law own data to government. It goes through them, it comes back to us. So there's a lot of restrictions around how we look at outcomes in particular. So one of the things that we did very early on was establish that we needed a London Learner Survey to be able to do that. And we worked really hard with the sector to achieve that. We also then had to look at what outcomes we wanted to be, what were the outcomes that are really important to London. Now, we could have probably done that much quicker if we just focused on economic outcomes, but I think, as we were talking about earlier, the value of learning is far greater to society than just those economic outcomes. So we wanted to look at those social outcomes as well. So we had a period of time where we needed to develop that. Now, obviously, we hoped that the survey would go out earlier. The pandemic hit, colleges and all training providers were shut. We did do some work with our institutions to say, should we go with this? They were saying, absolutely not at the moment. We won't get the response we need from it. So we decided to delay until April with full rollout from September. So the secondary thing to that is the nature of learning. Now, many of our courses are short courses, and we'll get that information back quickly, where a learner has undertaken, a 6-8 week course. Hopefully they'll fill the survey in the beginning, they'll fill it in at the end, and we'll start to see that data. But a lot of the qualifications that individuals undertake are much longer than that. So whether that's a level 2 qualification, which is probably a year, or whether that's a level 3 qualification, which is potentially 2 years. So there is a natural lag to some of this information coming through anyway. What we're wanting to do is measure the the individual at the beginning of their course, at the end, and then where they are at a period of time after that. So there is that lag. We recognise it's not perfect, but I think we're doing possibly the best we can with the circumstances we've received. And what we're also doing, as I said earlier, is looking at delivery plans and other information, the data we get back, to sort of calibrate all of this to see how we can adapt provision as we move forward.
Okay, thank you. I think it's an extraordinary thing you're trying to measure people's mental well-being and happiness. I think that the challenge will be separating out the education portion from the other things in their lives that have led to their state. But I stop there. Thank you for your answer, and I give you Assembly Member Bakari.
This is for the Deputy Mayor. How will the quality of London's 4 new careers hubs be assessed? Are these hubs being scaled up quickly enough to respond to the pandemic, and what could be done to accelerate the programme?
In line with all GLA programmes, there will be an evaluation. There's an amount set aside for that. Probably Michelle can go into far greater detail than I could.
Okay, happy to go to Michelle.
I was actually going to bring in James. He's actually leading the programme.
That's true. That's absolutely very, very happy to come in there. So I think the first thing to say is we have the Gatsby benchmarks nationally. They are the gold standard for careers education, and there are 8 benchmarks within that allow schools and colleges to assess themselves against how good their careers advice and guidance is. What we've seen over a number of years is schools and colleges that are in hubs outperform considerably those that are not in hubs around that. So one of the key metrics we will be measuring, as it is a KPI for us from DFE and the work that we do with the GLA, will be measuring the performance, and we have targets around certain benchmarks. So there's a real clear metric there to look at success over a year period. What's really heartening for us as well is recently we've done a bit of research that has shown a strong correlation between Gatsby benchmarks and outcomes for young people progressing into positive destinations. And that's really important for us, primarily because of what we've just been talking about in terms of outcomes. Now, we've had to wait for that because of the lag in data and making sure that a young person has moved all the way through the different years to see the impact that it's had on them. I think what's also really helpful with that is that we see that those institutions that have higher than average free school meals have an even better outcomes data than those that don't. So I think it's really important there that not only are we a universal offer, but we can see that it impacts on those that want to target the most as well. So throughout this year, we have a number of KPIs, a number of metrics that we will be measuring, and we will be able to see that correlation between the outputs of the Gatsby benchmarks and the outcomes in terms of young people being able to progress. In terms of rollout and speed, I think worth highlighting that this is the largest rollout of hubs that we've had anywhere in the country that we're doing in London, and I think that shows our intent and the importance that we see of rolling hubs out in London. We also have a 3-year plan, so it's not just a 1-year plan, it's a 3-year plan, and by the end of those 3 years we will see every single young person in a school or college benefiting from being in a hub. Until then, again, I think it's worth highlighting that just as previous years, the lean is still in place. It is not that those that have and those that have not. The Enterprise Advisor Network is still in place, and will continue to support those young people that are in schools and colleges that aren't in this hub whilst they transition into a hub. I hope that satisfies the question.
Yeah. I just want to clarify, did you say every single young person in London who has access to this hub will see, are you saying every single young person in London, or every single young person who's involved with the Careers Hub it will be?
So the ambition this year is that absolutely every single school and college, it is not mandatory, it is optional, but we've seen great take up across London. So every young person that is in a school or college that wants to be part of the LEAN, right, so the Enterprise Advisor Network, or the Careers Hub, will benefit from this.
And I'm just wondering if there are any potential gaps where you can see a young group of people who possibly may benefit from it but are not choosing to. Is there a possibility of that happening at all within this scheme?
I think in terms of what's really helpful is that we have a tool called Compass and Compass Plus that allows, Compass Plus in particular allows schools and colleges, schools to identify specific cohorts of individuals and look at the support that they're receiving. And that's really important because it doesn't just allow us to provide support to those that have already had a good amount of support. It allows at a local level for that career leader, for the SLT, to identify those that aren't getting the level of support that they should be, and to put interventions and support in place that will be able to support them. So I think absolutely there is a risk. However, there are activities, there are tools in place that allow us to mitigate against those risks.
Thank you very much for your very full answer. I'll go back to the Deputy Mayor, and I think the skills agenda has been touched on many times, and I know that the Chair's also been focusing particularly on older Londoners, and I would like to just kind of focus again more on the opportunities for men and women and whether that's being addressed. But specifically for me, this is something that I'm wondering whether the Mayor has been doing work on. Are you, how involved are you involved with employers when it comes to this particular area, and groups that are representing employers like the CBI?
Well, there are a whole range of employers and sector coordinating bodies are involved in all parts of the Skills for Londoners programme, and organisations such as London First, we work very closely with them, both within the Skills for Londoners programme and alongside them generally on skills issues.
Thank you. Great, I'm happy with that.
Thank you very much. I would like to call in Assemblymember Haran.
Thank you, Chair. I suppose a major factor that perhaps impacts a global city like London disproportionately at the moment is Brexit. And I know Assemblymember Garrett spoke about the hospitality sector in particular and the skills shortages there. So we don't need to really go into that side of the argument. But we've also benefited in London from the European Social Fund. And in the pipeline, we have the forthcoming UK Shared Prosperity Fund. How will London guarantee its fair share of the Prosperity Fund so that it can continue to deliver skills programmes in our city, and particularly looking at areas where we have skills shortages, but also in light of the ESF funding situation as well? A question to the Deputy Mayor.
Yes, well, how can we ensure it? The Mayor is lobbying government. You know, the ESF funding has seen, significant, something like £70 million invested in the skills system over the last few years. And we're lobbying to see at least that amount of money replaced and come back to London under the UK SPF. I do worry, though, looking at how national funds have been dispersed over the last couple of years, that London may well be at a disadvantage for receiving that money.
Thank you. Likewise, I think I share some those concerns, particularly around the what we've seen so far around the levelling up agenda and the impact it's had on the negative impacts I think it's had on London so far. It's at a cost to London rather than in addition to London, and I think we could be disproportionately impacted given the impact of Brexit and European workers in our capital. Also, on the horizon is, and we haven't really touched on this, and the impact on skills is the expected Nationality on Borders Bill, and particularly importing skills and workers as well. Just wondering if there are any initial thoughts on that as well. I
mean, that's probably a question for my colleagues who aren't actually here today on the kind of broader economic question about migration and that place in the labour market. I mean, from my skills perspective, obviously I'm keen that we skill people up who are resident in Britain in London to take those jobs. That said, though, we shouldn't ever be a closed city. There's economic benefit to an exchange of ideas and skills through an exchange of personnel. So, the Mayor has strongly advocated for London being open to international talent, and we should continue to be so. And any legislation that undermines that free flow of ideas and talent can't be good for the economy.
Thank you. And another thing that the Mayor has been a long-term advocate of is devolution of career support to London. What response has the Mayor had from the government on this issue so far, which we know he's already been raising? Is there anything that this committee can do to help secure this devolution? And also, just to wrap up, I had an additional question, which I think we'll just wrap up in one together, about the devolution of 16 to 19 education, and what could the devolution of 16 to 19 education also deliver in London?
I mean, the mayor isn't seeking to, run sixth forms and recreate ILIA, but there would be a lot said for a better join up and the funding, perhaps for 16 to 19, to flow through City Hall in terms that it could be coordinated with that's spent in further education colleges. So I think there is a lot to explore there. The Mayor would be keen to do that, has been consistently throughout the last 5 years. Equally consistently, we've been saying about a properly funded devolved advice and guidance service. I think that, the devolution seems to, over the last decade or so, or more, 2 decades, has come in fits and starts. We've seen a bit of a hiatus over the last couple of years. I mean, the AEB was a huge milestone. It took a good, many years of lobbying to achieve. We did see a recent small amount of devolution for the additional level 3 funding that's increased the budget overall, but a whole new area of devolution. I think we're probably a way off that at the moment. Thank you.
So just to come in here, I think I need to make a plea for a bid for the UK Shared Prosperity Fund. I think it's only fair to say the government haven't provided any details. So the idea that we'll lose out, I think, is pure speculation. And I think we'll have to wait until those details come down the pipe before we suggest we're going to lose out. Because who knows?
I very much hope you're correct, Chair.
Yeah, and so do I. And so do I, Jules. I really do. But I think that point needs to be made. Jules, can I just quickly ask you a question? You talk about devolution of 16 to 19 education. What soundings are we getting from the sector? Because does the sector want to be decoupled from its national relationships? Should we get that devolution down here? I wonder if that's been. Have we had the conversation with them? Do they want to be devolved in that manner?
I'm not involved in any active conversation with schools. I mean, the issue isn't that far advanced. I think really I was stating a kind of a simple principle that I think we need to have better join up between 16 to 18 and 19 plus. There's a lot of overlap in the coverage that between sixth form education and the work that further education colleges are often undertaking.
Again, Julie, I don't say it to make a political point or be difficult, but people often talk about devolution, and us here in City Hall of all political shades are fans of devolution, but I just wondered had anybody spoken to this sector, because they may not want to be devolved. It reminds me when people talk about City Hall taking over the London Ambulance Service. I think you'll find they want to remain part of the NHS. So if we're going to have these conversations, I think we should at least speak to the partners before we float the ideas, because we could be generating an enemy, not a friend. But
well, as I was clear to point out when I began my response, the Mayor is not looking to recreate ILIA. We are not looking to take over schools.
And that's nice to hear, because I'm sure
it's about joining system ups, and like so much of what we've talked about today, it's about coordination.
Yeah. Don't get me wrong, Jules. I do think there is a role for joining it, because I think sometimes across every level of government we have too many silos, and every time you break down a silo, something positive happens. I just hope we involve the partners in any conversations we have before we float the ideas. But hey, that's just for me. Any more from? Well, that would bring us, I imagine, to the formal end of our questions for today. I'd like to thank all of our guests for their attendance. I have some formal business to conclude, so I can release all of my guests to the wild. Don't feel the need to stay. Of course, if you want to hear the formal business, you're welcome to do so. But thank you very much for your attendance and answering our questions. The committee really appreciates that. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you, Chair.
Can the committee note the report and the discussion? Can we also delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with party group lead members to agree any output arising from the meeting?
Agreed.
Can I ask the committee to note the work programme meeting dates as agreed by the London Assembly in its annual meeting on May the 14th, 2021?
Noted.
The next meeting of the Economy Committee agreed by the London Assembly will be agreed by the Assembly in due course, because we have our annual general meeting to agree all of our diary going forward, be it the next Mayor's Question Time. I have no urgent business, so this concludes today's meeting.
Thank you, Chair.